The Grand Halcyon Hotel stood tall in the heart of Manhattan, its shining glass panels catching the afternoon sun, a beacon of elegance and wealth. A line of black SUVs waited outside while bellboys rushed to carry Louis Vuitton suitcases and Gucci handbags inside the marble-floored lobby. Inside, guests lounged in velvet chairs beneath crystal chandeliers, their laughter muffled beneath the quiet ambiance of a string quartet that played near the entrance. Hidden in plain sight was a woman in a pressed navy blue housekeeping uniform. Her name tag read Marla, and she moved silently across the polished floor with a wheeled cart of cleaning supplies. Marla had dark skin, tightly braided hair beneath her cap, and warm eyes that carried stories few ever bothered to ask about. She bent slightly to wipe a glass coffee table, only to hear a sharp voice behind her. "Miss, you're blocking the executive suite guests. Step aside." The voice belonged to Cynthia Hartley, the hotel's assistant general manager. Dressed in an expensive gray pencil skirt and pearl earrings, she walked like she owned the place. Her sharp heels clicked menacingly on the floor as she stared Marla down, her blue eyes cold. Marla stood slowly, wiping her hands on her cleaning cloth. "Sorry, ma'am," she said in a gentle tone, and pushed her cart aside. Cynthia gave her a look of thinly veiled disdain, her lip curling slightly. "These halls are for our paying clientele. You and your mop belong out of sight." Guests looked up. A wealthy couple in designer outfits exchanged amused glances, the man letting out a snort. Marla kept her eyes down. The day moved on. Marla quietly finished cleaning the 18th floor, making beds, scrubbing marble countertops, organizing flower vases. She stopped once in the service corridor, pulling out a folded photo from her pocket. In it was a younger version of herself, standing in front of a school in Lagos, Nigeria, wearing a bright yellow dress and holding a book like a treasure. Marla smiled faintly, tucked the photo back into her pocket, and continued on. By 4 p.m., the Halcyon lobby grew even busier. Word had spread. The owner of the Halcyon brand, a reclusive billionaire who hadn't appeared in public in years, was rumored to be visiting incognito to assess one of the properties. The staff buzzed in panic. Cynthia, puffed with self-importance, strutted through the halls barking orders. "Check the suites again. Get rid of the cheap-scented soaps. Replace the orchids in the penthouse." She paused as she saw Marla kneeling near the fountain, picking up bits of torn napkins someone had left. Cynthia's scowl deepened. "Still here?" she sneered. "Go, clean the loading dock instead. Or do you prefer an audience for your scrubbing?" Marla stood slowly, looked her in the eye for the first time, and said softly, "I'll go where I'm needed." There was something in her voice. Quiet, firm, unshakable. That made Cynthia pause for a split second. But she quickly masked it with a scoff and turned on her heel. That evening, the hotel prepared for the mysterious owner's arrival. A security team arrived first, scanning the lobby discreetly. Then, as the sun dipped low over the skyline, a woman in a simple black dress and modest heels walked through the revolving doors. Guests barely noticed her. Staff whispered uncertainly. Cynthia, checking her reflection in the gold-framed mirror behind the front desk, didn't even glance up, until the woman stopped directly in front of her. "Good evening," she said with a calm, commanding tone. "I'd like to speak to your general manager." Cynthia looked up, irritated. "Do you have an appointment? We don't give tours to civilians, ma'am." "I'm not here for a tour," the woman said, producing a sleek black business card. "I'm here to assess the hospitality standards of this location. I believe this card should answer your questions." Cynthia took the card, and her face drained of color. The name engraved in silver cursive read, Marla O. Adeyemi, CEO, Halcyon Worldwide Group, she stammered. You can't be—" Marla smiled gently, taking off the cap she still wore from earlier. "It's me. I often like to observe from the ground. Gives me a clearer view of what happens when no one's watching. Cynthia looked around in horror as nearby staff stopped in place. The bellboy dropped a bag. The wealthy couple who had laughed earlier turned ghost white. "You treated me like dirt," Marla said quietly. "And today you revealed your character." Cynthia opened her mouth, but Marla raised a hand. "We'll talk later. For now, I want to speak with your cleaning staff. They're the backbone of this hotel. It's time they were seen." The story had only just begun, and by the time it ended, no one would ever forget the name Marla O. Adeyemi. The next morning, the Halcyon Grand was abuzz with whispers. Word of what had happened the previous evening spread like wildfire, not from press releases or social media posts, but through hushed conversations behind staff doors, nervous glances in the corridors, and stunned expressions exchanged in the elevators. By 8 a.m., nearly every employee, from the pastry chef in the basement kitchen to the concierge at the top-floor lounge, had heard the same 5 words spoken in disbelief. "She owns the whole chain." Marla O. Adeyemi's identity had shaken the foundation of Halcyon's internal hierarchy. No one had expected that the quiet, dark-skinned woman who had spent 2 weeks scrubbing toilets and mopping floors was not just a part of the team, but the woman who signed the paychecks, owned the buildings, and had enough influence to either make or break careers across the industry. But none were more shaken than Cynthia Hartley. She sat in her office that morning, the blinds drawn tightly against the sunlight that crept through the skyline. Her hair was pulled into an unusually tight bun, her makeup slightly smeared from a sleepless night. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stared at the screen before her, an email draft blinking with only 2 words written. "Dear Ms." She couldn't even finish it. Not yet. Her pride wouldn't let her. Not after what she'd said. Not after that slap of truth that had unraveled her world. It wasn't just that she had insulted a woman who turned out to be a billionaire. That would have been humiliating enough. It was how she had done it, so loudly, so publicly, with layers of disdain wrapped in every smirk and insult. Cynthia had built her career on the idea of power through control. And now, she realized, real power was often quiet, observing, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. Outside her office, staff were moving with unusual discipline. Even the most lax bellhops were standing straighter, the front desk workers speaking more respectfully to every guest. The cleaning team, usually ignored, was now greeted with nods, thank yous, and even coffee deliveries from nervous supervisors. But one person was conspicuously missing from the morning briefing: Marla. She hadn't been seen since the night before, when she'd calmly announced her identity and asked for a private moment with the cleaning staff. She had disappeared into the lower levels of the hotel with them, leaving behind a stunned silence and a sea of dropped jaws. No one knew what she had said, but they knew it had changed something. Later that day in the staff lounge, Lena, a young Filipina housekeeper with warm brown eyes and a nervous energy, sat quietly with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea. Beside her, Kofi, a Ghanaian maintenance worker who'd been with the hotel for 14 years, leaned forward with concern in his voice. "She talked to all of you?" he asked in a whisper. Lena nodded slowly. She didn't yell. She didn't judge us. She listened. She asked about our lives, our families, what it's like to clean rooms all day and still feel invisible. Kofi's brows furrowed. "And what did she say in return?" Lena hesitated, then smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. She said, "You've held this building together while others pretended they did. That changes today." Downstairs, in the grand ballroom, currently closed to the public, a private meeting had just concluded. Marla stood at the center of the room, surrounded by the regional executives of Halcyon worldwide. Her presence was calm, but every word she spoke cut deep. "I didn't come here to find flaws in the paint or dust in the corners," she said, pacing slowly across the polished floor. "I came to see if the soul of this hotel still lives, and what I saw in your management was a system that thrives on appearances, not substance." The executives remained silent, most too stunned to speak. They had only ever known Marla through conference calls, quarterly emails, and the occasional distant photo from a shareholders' summit. Seeing her in person, here in their domain, was a revelation they hadn't prepared for. Marla turned to face them fully. "Do you know why I chose to work incognito as a maid?" One man, Rodney, the regional VP, cleared his throat nervously. "To evaluate performance from the ground level?" Marla's gaze was sharp, but not unkind. "No. I did it to remember where I came from." She walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. "My mother scrubbed floors in a hotel not unlike this one. She did it with dignity, even when people spat at her. And I swore, if I ever had the power to change that story for someone else, I would." She turned again, her voice firm. "There will be changes. Starting today, frontline staff evaluations will now impact executive bonuses. Housekeeping will receive equity options, and I will be personally reviewing every discrimination complaint from the last 3 years. A murmur spread through the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at her in disbelief. She continued, "Because luxury without humanity is just expensive cruelty." As she left the room, her assistant handed her an envelope. Inside, a printed message from a senior guest praising the sweet maid with the kind eyes who had returned his missing wedding ring without taking credit. Marla smiled faintly. That had been her, of course. Quietly doing what needed to be done, not because anyone was watching, but because that's who she was. Meanwhile, Cynthia sat in her office, now hearing murmurs of a town hall scheduled for that evening. All staff were required to attend. The whispers said it would be streamed to every Halcyon property around the world, and that Marla would speak. Cynthia's stomach turned. She realized something. The humiliation she feared might only just be beginning, but Marla wasn't out for vengeance. Her path was different. One of grace and change, not just punishment. Still, the consequences had only just begun to unfold. And by the time the town hall ended, the entire world would know what happens when you mock the wrong maid. By evening, the Grand Halcyon's ballroom had transformed from a private meeting space into the epicenter of something much bigger. Velvet chairs lined the rows, polished brass lights cast a gentle glow, and a large LED screen stood behind the podium displaying a single phrase: "A new standard begins now." Employees filed in slowly at first, their usual chatter replaced by curiosity and tension. Word had spread not just through the building, but across the Halcyon network. Branches from Singapore to San Francisco were dialing in. Housekeepers, chefs, bellhops, front desk managers, even chauffeurs from partner firms, all eyes were on Manhattan. But no one felt the weight more than Cynthia Hartley, who sat near the side of the room, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a stiff smile as if she could still perform her way out of the mess. But behind her eyes was a storm. She had seen the internal memo. She knew this wasn't just a speech. It was a reckoning. When Marla Adeyemi finally stepped onto the stage, the room didn't erupt into applause. Instead, it fell into a reverent silence, a stillness that clung to the air like gravity. Dressed in a tailored midnight blue suit, Marla stood calmly, the picture of quiet command. She began without preamble. "My name," she said, "is Marla Omotayo Adeyemi, and for the past 2 weeks, most of you knew me as Marla the maid." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. No malice in her tone, no fire in her words, but every syllable hit like a wave. "I did not hide who I was to deceive anyone. I hid who I was to see who you really were." The word sent an almost physical ripple through the room. I was spoken to like I was dirt, she continued. I was ignored, stepped over, insulted, and for some, I was invisible entirely. But I also saw people who chose kindness without expecting a reward. People who helped me carry towels, who smiled and said thank you, who offered me food from their own lunch breaks because they thought I looked tired. Her voice softened, but her conviction deepened. This company was built on my mother's back. She cleaned floors so I could rise. And now, I will rise with those who do the same. I will not allow any employee to feel inferior because of their uniform, their skin, or the sound of their name. The screen behind her changed. Photos began appearing. Grainy security footage of Marla picking up trash in the lobby, helping a crying guest with directions, comforting a young intern who had spilled coffee in front of a guest. And then came a clip. Cynthia, sneering, wagging. Her finger at Marla in front of stunned guests. Her voice raised, the words audible. You belong in the service entrance. A sharp intake of breath filled the room. Cynthia's body went rigid. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum in a war march. Marla turned to the camera. This isn't about vengeance. I have no desire to shame anyone publicly, but the system that allows this kind of behavior to thrive needs to be exposed. Because if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. She nodded to her assistant, who handed out sealed folders to each executive seated in the front rows. Inside are the new reforms. Performance evaluations from staff up to management will now include reverse reviews. Housekeepers will review supervisors and managers every quarter. Anonymous hotline for employee abuse, directly monitored by the central board, not by local managers. Equity shares offered to all housekeeping and service staff after 1 year of employment. Leadership apprenticeships open to anyone, regardless of education level. The room buzzed with energy. People whispered, eyes widened. The announcement didn't just address problems, it offered a blueprint for a new future. Then came the moment that turned the atmosphere electric. Marla looked directly at Cynthia. Miss Hartley, would you care to join me on stage? The room stiffened. Cynthia froze. This was it. For a moment, she thought of standing up. She thought of marching up to the podium and giving some impassioned speech about learning and growing, but her feet wouldn't move. Shame, not pride, held her down. She began, but her voice cracked. Marla stepped forward slowly. Let me tell you what I learned about you. Cynthia looked up, terrified. You are efficient. You can run a schedule like a machine. Your quarterly reports are immaculate. Your guest satisfaction ratings are high, among executive clientele. A flicker of hope crossed Cynthia's face. But, Marla continued, your treatment of employees who don't look like you? Unacceptable. Dehumanizing. And it contradicts every value we claim to uphold. Silence again. I am placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. Whether you return to this company will depend, not on whether you beg, but whether you rebuild. Cynthia's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She nodded slowly, the room spinning, her world collapsing from the inside out. Marla turned back to the crowd. I built this company to create opportunity, not hierarchy. You wear a name tag? That doesn't make you lesser. It means you're brave. You clean floors? That doesn't make you invisible. It means you carry the dignity of work. Applause erupted. This time, not polite, not slow, but thunderous. From the janitor in the back row to the chef still wearing his apron, the room came alive with the sound of belonging. And at the side of the stage, with tears silently rolling down her face, Lena, the same housekeeper Marla had spoken to, smiled wider than she ever had. That night, the hotel changed forever, and the world outside began to take notice. By morning, Marla's full speech was trending on every platform. Marla the maid topped hashtags globally. The video had over 30 million views in 18 hours. Influencers were reposting it. Corporations began quoting her lines in diversity training presentations. Headlines flooded media feeds. Billionaire CEO goes undercover as maid to expose discrimination. Grace, power, and change. Marla Adeyemi's revolution. She cleaned toilets. Then she cleaned house. But for Marla, it wasn't about fame. It was about fixing something broken. Not just in her hotel, but in every mind that believed power had a look, a skin tone, or a tax bracket. She sat in her office the next morning, sipping tea in peace, when her assistant walked in with a pile of letters, some printed emails, some handwritten from staff around the world. The first one read, "Thank you for seeing us. I haven't felt proud of my job in years, until now." Marla smiled softly and whispered, "Now the real work begins." The sun rose slowly over Manhattan the next morning, casting soft golden rays onto the Halcyon's high-rise glass windows. But inside the building, something more profound than morning light was unfolding. The atmosphere had changed, not just in tone, but in spirit. What had begun as a quiet act of disguise had now exploded into a global movement. Marla Adeyemi's story was no longer confined to the ornate corridors of the Grand Halcyon. It had breached boundaries, resonating across cultures, industries, and class divides. Inside the employee break room, a group of housekeepers from various backgrounds, Haitian, Colombian, Bangladeshi, and Polish, stood shoulder to shoulder, huddled around a smartphone. On the screen played the now viral clip of Marla's speech. They watched in awe, some with tears rolling down their cheeks, others with soft smiles as Marla's voice echoed through the device. "You wear a name tag? That doesn't make you lesser, it means you're brave." None of them had ever heard someone say that out loud before, especially not someone in charge. In Nigeria, a teacher paused his lecture in a crowded classroom and played the video for his students, pointing to the screen with pride. "That woman," he said, "grew up not far from here. And now the world listens when she speaks." In Paris, a hotel union leader cited Marla's policies as a case study for ethical leadership in hospitality. In Johannesburg, a janitorial worker wrote her a handwritten letter. In Manila, a woman named Bernadette, who had lost her job in a luxury hotel after reporting harassment, wept silently while watching Marla stand on the ballroom stage, unapologetic, composed, powerful. Back in New York, the Halcyon boardroom was now the setting for a very different kind of meeting. Marla sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, surrounded not by yes-men or executives armed with PR damage control plans, but by a diverse panel of employees, real workers, many of whom had never been invited to sit in that room before. To her right was Kofi, the longtime maintenance supervisor who had never worn a tie to work, now seated beside Lena, the quiet Filipina housekeeper who had once been ignored for promotions. To Marla's left sat Jose, a kitchen porter who spoke English with a thick accent, but whose ideas flowed like poetry when finally given space to speak. "This," Marla began, "is not a token committee. This is the new leadership lens." The panel was called Voices of the Foundation. Their job was clear. No policy, no program, no expansion would move forward in Halcyon's global network without passing through their lived perspectives first. The meeting began humbly. Questions about health insurance access, fair scheduling, and break times. But it soon evolved into something deeper. "Why do our uniforms look different from those in the front office?" Lena asked. "Why does housekeeping enter through the service elevator?" Jose added. Kofi raised a hand. "Why are performance bonuses only available to managers when the room scores depend on our work?" Marla listened, her expression soft but focused. She wasn't just checking a box. She was absorbing, learning, and building. Meanwhile, Cynthia Hartley remained silent in the shadows of suspension. Her apartment, once decorated with expensive marble sculptures and framed accolades, now felt like a prison of regrets. She hadn't returned any calls. Her inbox was flooded, but she hadn't opened a single message. Her name trended briefly, Cynthia Unmasked, before being drowned out by the louder, more powerful wave of support for Marla. She sat at her kitchen counter staring at an old photo of her younger self in her very first hotel uniform. She'd forgotten that girl, the one who had once worked double shifts to pay her way through night school, the one who smiled when guests said thank you, the one who believed in the dignity of hospitality before she became consumed with hierarchy. For the first time in years, Cynthia cried, not for her job, but for how far she had drifted from who she used to be. Back at Halcyon, a delivery arrived at Marla's office. It was a large envelope marked in silver ink, from the desk of the governor of New York. Inside was a handwritten letter expressing deep admiration and an invitation for Marla to speak at the upcoming State Leadership and Equity Forum. Attached was a brief note from the governor's secretary. Ms. Adeyemi, your story didn't just spark reform, it's igniting a national conversation. People want to hear your voice. People need it. Marla set the letter down gently. She hadn't set out to become a symbol. She simply wanted dignity restored to those who'd gone too long without it. But now, the movement had momentum, and her story had become a beacon. Still, she remained grounded. Later that evening, Marla requested a quiet moment. She walked through the hotel's service hallways again, just like she had in her uniform days. She greeted staff by name, listened to their stories, shook hands, and offered kind smiles. In one narrow corridor near the loading dock, she paused by a utility closet. A faded sign read, "Staff only." She pulled it off the door, folded it in half, and tucked it into her pocket. "No more lines between us," she whispered. At the same time, an internal email went out to every Halcyon employee in the world. It bore Marla's signature and a single subject line, "To the ones who built the house." The message read, "You've held the doors open, cleaned the floors, carried the weight, and smiled through storms. This house stands because of you, and moving forward, this house will see you, hear you, and rise with you. Your name tags are no longer hidden badges of silence. They are medals of honor." The message ended simply, Marla. Tears welled in the eyes of countless workers across continents. Some printed it and taped it inside their lockers. Others read it aloud during shift changes. Some just sat in silence, letting the words soak into wounds they hadn't known they carried. The ripples had turned into waves, and waves were reshaping the world. And yet, this was still just the beginning. There were still boardrooms that scoffed, still managers who rolled their eyes, still industries that believed power only lived in suits and silence. But they hadn't met Marla yet. They would soon. The Halcyon was changing, and so was Cynthia Hartley. She hadn't been fired. Not yet. Marla had given her something rare. A pause. A time to reflect, to decide who she would be going forward. But that time was nearly up. Her leave was reaching its final week. A decision would be made soon. And the board had already asked for Marla's recommendation. Cynthia sat alone at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from the glimmering towers she once commanded like a queen. Her blazer was wrinkled. Her nails, once pristine, were now bare. She held a plain mug of black coffee and watched people pass by on the street, nannies with strollers, construction workers in dusty boots, delivery boys whizzing past on bikes, and then she saw something that stopped her breath. Across the street stood a woman in a housekeeping uniform, not from Halcyon, a different hotel, a smaller chain. But the way the manager spoke to her, with that same impatient finger-pointing Cynthia used to do, hit her like a punch to the stomach. The housekeeper's eyes flinched, then dropped to the ground as she scurried away without a word. Cynthia stared. That had been her. That was her. Suddenly, all the justifications she'd made for years, standards, efficiency, brand image, all crumbled under the truth she could no longer deny. She had chosen power over humanity, appearance over respect, control over compassion. That night she didn't sleep. She opened her laptop and typed a message, then deleted it, then typed again. By sunrise, her hands trembled over the mouse as she hovered above the send button. It was a letter to Marla. No excuses, no flowery apologies. Just the truth. Dear Ms. Adeyemi, I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. What I did to you, and likely to many others, wasn't just rude. It was wrong. I became the kind of manager I used to fear. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people and started seeing status. You gave me a chance to see that. And while I can't change who I was yesterday, I want to fight for who I can be tomorrow, if you'll allow it. I'd like to earn my place back, not at the top, but wherever I can do the most good. Cynthia, she hit send before fear could talk her out of it. 2 days later, she received a reply. It was a single line. Let's talk. And so they did. Inside Marla's office, the conversation wasn't easy. Cynthia sat upright, every instinct telling her to prepare a defense. But Marla didn't attack her. She listened. She asked questions. Questions that dug deeper than any board meeting Cynthia had ever attended. What was the first moment you forgot how it felt to be unseen? What would you change about your past leadership? Not for the optics, but for the souls under it. Cynthia answered them all, truthfully. Sometimes through tears. Sometimes through silence. At the end of it, Marla stood and said something that struck harder than any scolding ever could. Growth is slow, she said, but so is rot. You can't undo the damage, but you can plant something better in its place. Then she slid a file across the table. Cynthia opened it. It wasn't a termination letter, it was a job offer, but not for assistant general manager, not for any executive post, it was for director of staff culture and ethics. I don't want a yes woman, Marla said. I want someone who knows the cost of blindness and is willing to teach others how to see. Cynthia's lips trembled. Are you sure? Marla nodded. Only if you are. Meanwhile, the Halcyon hotels were undergoing a silent revolution. Across the world, uniform policies were being rewritten. Staff entrances were being redesigned. Employees were invited to share stories of bias they had once swallowed in silence. These stories were compiled into a powerful internal documentary, The Other Side of the Lobby. In one scene, a porter from Morocco shared how he was mistaken for a thief in the Paris branch. In another, a Nigerian chef described being asked if he could cook real food by a supervisor. Every testimony was raw, unpolished, and deeply human. Marla didn't appear once in the documentary. She didn't need to. Her leadership wasn't about being seen. It was about helping others be seen at last. Back at the Grand Halcyon in New York, something small but monumental happened that week. For the first time in the hotel's history, the staff meal wasn't served in the back kitchen. It was held in the main ballroom. The chandeliers were lit. The tables were dressed. The string quartet played soft music. Housekeepers sat beside managers. Bellboys laughed with finance executives. Maintenance crew broke bread with HR officers. Laughter flowed easily. Names were remembered. At the front of the room, Marla stood with a glass of sparkling water in her hand. I don't want to be thanked, she said. I want to build something where no one has to go undercover just to be treated with basic respect. The room applauded, loudly, not for the luxury, not for the leadership, but for the love that had re-entered the heart of a corporation. Later, that night, as the staff danced and ate, Cynthia stood in a corner watching quietly. She didn't try to take the mic. She didn't insert herself into the spotlight. Instead, she walked over to Lena, the housekeeper who once flinched at her presence. I never said thank you, Cynthia said softly. Lena blinked. For what? For staying kind, she whispered. Even when I didn't deserve it. Lena smiled gently. Kindness isn't earned, it's chosen. They clinked water glasses. Not as boss and worker, but as people. Outside the hotel, a young woman in jeans stood staring at the building. She was a journalism student. She had seen Marla's video. She had read the articles. And now, she stood on the sidewalk looking up, at the place where it all began. She held her notebook tightly, then whispered to herself, "One day, I'll tell stories that change lives like this." And somewhere inside, a quiet billionaire stood near a window, watching the same city she'd once cleaned on her knees, and smiled. The change was real, the lesson was lasting, and the world was only just starting to listen. The autumn wind danced through the trees surrounding the United Nations headquarters in New York. A gentle hush had fallen over the large, glass-paneled conference hall where diplomats, CEOs, activists, and world leaders had gathered for the global summit on equity and workspaces. At the center of the schedule, circled in red in nearly every attendee's pamphlet, was a keynote speaker whose name had become a symbol of dignity and power. Marla Omotayo Adeyemi. It wasn't just that she had changed a hotel, it was the way she had changed how people saw each other, and more importantly, how they saw those they used to overlook. As she walked toward the stage that morning, there was no dramatic music, no choreographed entrance, just a woman in a deep emerald green suit walking with the calm of someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. The moment she stood behind the podium, silence fell like snow across the room. Not even a cough or shuffle. Cameras zoomed in. Phones streamed live. Every major news outlet was tuned in. Hashtags began to trend before she had even spoken. Then she began. "I once scrubbed floors," she said, her voice steady, "in a place where I would one day sign million-dollar contracts. No one knew who I was. Not because I wore a disguise, but because they never looked close enough." The statement was a hammer wrapped in velvet, gentle but shattering. Marla looked across the sea of faces, men and women who led empires, who ran global companies, who had the power to hire or fire thousands with the flick of a pen. They called it going undercover, she continued. "I call it going home, because I've never left the service class, I simply stepped into new rooms." Gasps rippled across the room. "I was treated like I didn't belong. Not because I broke the rules, but because the system was designed to assume I couldn't afford to be there, that I wasn't one of them." Her hands rested on the sides of the podium, her fingers calm, her gaze unshaken. And when I finally revealed my truth, some were shocked. But what shocked me more was how many others, housekeepers, drivers, janitors, wrote to me afterward saying, "You spoke. What we've lived all our lives." The screen behind her lit up with messages from staff all over the world. Faces, names, job titles, from a receptionist in Morocco to a bellhop in Vancouver, from a dishwasher in Mumbai to a night guard in Johannesburg. All thanking her. All finally seen. Marla turned back to the room. "What does it say about our society?" she asked. "When a person must own the building just to be treated like they belong in it?" The room was still, breathless. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the podium, but every word was an earthquake. "I'm not here to entertain or inspire," she said plainly. "I'm here to challenge, because inspiration fades, but accountability doesn't." Then came the line that would echo around the world. "From this day forward, if your company's luxury rests on someone else's invisibility, then what you offer isn't success. It's silence polished in marble. Silence." Then, thunder. The hall erupted in applause, not the kind born of politeness, but the kind that comes from hearts broken open, from truths finally given shape and voice. Marla stepped down quietly. She didn't bask in the moment. She didn't wave. She simply walked back to her seat, her presence like a tide that had swept through every barrier in the room. Back at Halcyon Hotels, live streams of her speech played on giant TVs in lobbies, in staff rooms, even in executive lounges. Employees gathered shoulder to shoulder, tears glistening in eyes that had seen far too much dismissal and far too little recognition. And as Marla's words rippled around the globe, so did her reforms. In Tokyo, a five-star hotel introduced an open-door policy where all staff could attend leadership meetings monthly, regardless of role. In Berlin, hospitality unions referenced her speech during negotiations. In Dubai, a luxury hotel chain rewrote its equity policy, adding clauses inspired word for word by Marla's town hall address. At Halcyon itself, the evolution deepened. Every quarter now opened with a cross-rank forum. It was called the Mirror Room, a space where any staff member could share their truth, anonymously or in person, with executives listening in complete silence, without reply or rebuttal. The rule was simple. You're here to hear. In the first meeting, Lena stood up and told a story she had never told before. "When I first moved to New York," she said softly, "I worked double shifts and slept in stairwells between jobs. One morning, my shoes broke on my way to work. I taped them with duct tape and hoped no one would notice." Her voice cracked. "But Cynthia," she noticed, and she laughed. A quiet gasp moved through the room. Cynthia, now seated in the audience, not as a superior but as a fellow staff member, stood and bowed her head. "I remember," she said aloud, "and I was wrong." Lena nodded once and sat. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about healing, and healing, they were learning, often began with the hardest kind of truth, the one about yourself. That weekend, Marla visited the Halcyon branch in Lagos, Nigeria. She hadn't been back in years. The red clay roads, the scent of roasted ground nuts, the market women with baskets on their heads, it all felt like stepping into a poem she had once memorized in childhood. At the hotel entrance, a girl not older than 12 stood in a school uniform selling bananas from a tray. She looked tired, determined. Much like Marla had at that age, Marla knelt, smiled, and handed the girl a small card with a number and a name. "Come here next Saturday," she said. "Ask for me. I think we can help each other." The girl stared, then nodded, clutching the card like a golden ticket. Later, at the branch's courtyard ceremony, staff and guests alike gathered as the local manager announced the renaming of the Employee Training Center. It would now be called the House of Marla. Not because she needed a monument, but because they needed a memory, a reminder of what was possible when dignity was placed above ego, when kindness was louder than status, and when a woman who had once mopped floors decided she'd rather build doors for others than climb ladders alone. The rain tapped gently against the glass walls of Marla's New York office, where she stood alone, gazing out at the shimmering skyline. The city pulsed with life. Cabs honked below, billboards flashed, and yet a rare stillness filled the May room. In front of her, resting atop her sleek walnut desk, was a letter, handwritten, yellowed with age, addressed to her in shaky cursive, "To my daughter, when she becomes a woman." She had found it just days ago while visiting her childhood home in Lagos. It had been folded into the back of an old recipe book, one she hadn't opened since her mother passed. Her mother, Adebayo Adeyemi, a quiet giant with roughened hands and eyes that saw everything. A woman who never stepped foot in a boardroom, but who had once told Marla, "A mop held with dignity will take you further than a crown carried with cruelty." Marla unfolded the letter with care. "My Marla, if you're reading this, it means you've grown. Maybe you're important now. Maybe you're still finding your way. But whether you wear a uniform or a crown, never forget whose shoulders you stand on. This World will try to define you by how quietly you enter a room, how dark your skin is, how poor you once were. But you are not their assumptions. You are mine. And that means you are built from courage. If one day you are in a place where others must bow to you, remember the weight of kneeling yourself. If you lead, lead with grace. If you rise, lift others. And if they ever tell you you don't belong, stand taller. Because I raised you for every door they'll try to close. Mama Marla pressed the letter to her chest. The timing was divine. Her world had changed, but so had she. She was no longer just an executive or a CEO. She was a vessel for something bigger, something deeper, a movement. She opened a new document on her laptop. A draft of her next global initiative, the Adeyemi Fellowship for Dignity in Work, a multi-million-dollar endowment aimed at supporting education, career development, and legal defense for workers across hospitality, domestic labor, and service industries worldwide. But more than money, the fellowship would tell a story, a living legacy. It would travel into kitchens, janitor closets, and staff rooms in cities far from spotlights. It would say, "You matter. You are seen. You are sacred." Meanwhile, at Halcyon branches around the world, a symbolic change took root. In every hotel, a wall was designated the Wall of Names. No golden plaques for executives. No faceless Employee of the Month certificates. Just Polaroids, handwritten notes, and short bios of employees who rarely got thanked. Dishwasher in Nairobi, doorman in Chicago, maid in Seoul. Stories that echoed the soul of the brand. Guests, many of them billionaires, now stopped to read them. They smiled. Some wept. Some even left thank you notes behind for the workers whose photos moved them. It was no longer about appearance. It was about presence. Back at the Grand Halcyon, something unexpected was happening. Cynthia Hartley, formerly feared, now reformed, had quietly begun mentoring new hires, not with spreadsheets or cold precision, but with compassion. She shared her failures, her shame, and most importantly, the moment her eyes were opened by the very woman she tried to humiliate. She no longer sat in an executive office. She sat among the staff. She led training sessions on emotional intelligence. She coached managers on listening, and when asked what her official title was, she simply replied, "I'm a mirror now. I help people see themselves more clearly." One day, as she was leaving the training lounge, she found a note taped to her locker. It read, "You're not who you were, and we're glad you're still here. Lena." Her hands trembled as she folded it. She would keep that paper longer than any promotion letter she ever received. The impact reached unexpected corners. In a small town in Mississippi, a black single mother who worked night shifts cleaning at a motel watched Marla's story on her phone. She saved up for 3 months to attend a hospitality seminar hosted by the Halcyon Foundation. There, she shared her story, and by the end of it, she was offered a full scholarship to complete her degree and a job offer to join Halcyon's Southern Regional Office. In the Philippines, Lena's younger sister, inspired by the changes at Halcyon, applied for a job as a front desk intern. On her first day, she was surprised when the regional director, once a man she would have never approached, personally welcomed her with a plate of local pastries. "This is your house, too," he said. "We're just guests in it." Then came an unexpected phone call from Geneva. The United Nations wanted to honor Marla Adeyemi with the Global Human Dignity Award, an honor reserved for world leaders, visionaries, and changemakers. But Marla, true to herself, declined the stage. Instead, she asked that the award be presented not in a banquet hall, but inside a hotel service corridor. The place where her story began, and so it was. In a humble hallway in Lagos, beside mops and buckets, the plaque was mounted. Beneath it read a quote in both English and Yoruba. "True power is not how many follow you, but how many rise beside you. On the anniversary of the day Marla was humiliated by Cynthia, Halcyon instituted a new tradition, Reflection Day, a company-wide event where no one worked, only gathered. Employees and leaders shared one truth from the year that changed them. Tears were common, laughter even more so. And Marla? She walked among them, no speeches, no cameras, just listening, always listening, because that was her legacy, not buildings, not awards, but ears that listened, eyes that saw, hearts that remembered. That evening, as Marla walked to her car, a young girl about 13 approached her in a school uniform. She was holding a mop in one hand and a journal in the other. "Are you the woman from the video?" the girl asked shyly. Marla crouched down and smiled. "That depends. What did the woman do?" "She made people feel like queens," the girl whispered, "even when they were just cleaners." Marla reached into her purse and pulled out a pen. She signed the girl's journal and whispered back, "There's no such thing as just a cleaner, and one day you'll remind the world again." As she stood and walked away, the city lights shimmered around her, but her glow was quieter. It didn't need spotlights because it came from within, and it never faded. The Grand Halcyon still stood tall in Manhattan, but it was no longer just known for its luxury. It had become a symbol of something greater, humanity with elegance, power without cruelty, and leadership that began from the floor and rose up. It had been 5 years since Marla Adeyemi stepped into the building disguised as a maid. 5 years since a single slap and a single seat sparked a global conversation. But the true legacy was not written in press releases or corporate statements. It was written in hearts. On this particular autumn morning, the Halcyon lobby buzzed with warmth. Staff and guests moved in harmony. The woman arranging flowers was greeted by name. A young bellhop received a standing ovation in the lounge after returning a lost diamond bracelet. Laughter floated through the halls. No one was unseen anymore. At the far end of the atrium, a bronze statue stood in a quiet alcove. It wasn't grand or imposing. It was life-sized, humble. The sculpture showed a woman in a maid's uniform, head held high, mop in hand, eyes looking toward the horizon. On the plaque below were just 3 words: "Dignity, without permission, Marla." Had never wanted the statue, but the staff insisted, not to idolize her, but to immortalize the truth she had reminded the world of. Upstairs, in the executive suite that once intimidated even seasoned diplomats, Marla sat in an armchair by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her hair now had streaks of silver, but her gaze was as clear and steady as ever. She was no longer CEO of the Halcyon brand. She had stepped down 6 months earlier to focus full-time on her foundation. The transition had been seamless. She had mentored her successor from the ground up, a former kitchen steward from Cape Town named Malika Hassan, whose leadership style mirrored Marla's grace, strength, and humility. As Marla sipped her tea, her assistant entered with a smile. "They're ready for you downstairs." Marla stood slowly. Her knees ached a bit more now, but her posture remained unshakable. She walked through the familiar halls, not as a stranger in disguise, not as a figure of media frenzy, but as a living story that had taught an empire to remember its soul. Downstairs in the ballroom, the energy was electric. The room was packed, not just with Halcyon employees, but with leaders from multiple industries, university students, social workers, janitors, former refugees, and volunteers. The event was the annual Marla Adeyemi Forum for Dignity and Work, a global conference that had grown from a humble Zoom call in year 1 to an annual gathering broadcast in 42 languages. As she took the stage, the crowd rose, not out of obligation, but from affection. Marla raised a hand. "Sit, sit. We've got work to do." Laughter bubbled, but soon, the room fell into the same familiar silence that always followed her. She spoke without notes, as she always did. People often ask me what changed everything. Was it the speech, the slap, the viral video? She shook her head gently. No, it wasn't any of those. She stepped away from the podium, walking slowly across the stage. It was the moment I looked at a woman who couldn't see my worth, and chose not to see her as less in return. The audience was rapt, because that's where the real revolution lives, not in power, but in restraint, in refusing to return darkness for darkness, in returning fire with water, and in the quiet knowing that dignity cannot be taken, it can only be laid down. She paused and looked at the front row, where Cynthia Hartley now sat beside Lena, both of them smiling. Cynthia had spent the past 5 years rebuilding trust, not just in others, but within herself. She had helped implement human first policies in over 200 hotels across 4 continents. She still carried regret, but also pride in her rebirth. Marla continued. To the workers in this room, who still walk into jobs where your names are forgotten and your backs are turned to, I see you. And if the world forgets you tomorrow, I'll still remember you today. Applause erupted again, many wiping tears away. But the truth is, Marla said, her voice softening, this movement doesn't need me anymore. Gasps rippled quietly. She smiled. Because it's not mine. It's yours. It's in the way you hold doors for people who never say thank you. It's in how you speak with kindness even when you're tired. It's in how you don't wait for recognition to do the right thing. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the original maid's badge she had worn all those years ago. Scuffed, bent, faded. She held it in the air. This taught me more than any Ivy League degree, she said. It taught me how to lead, how to listen, and how to never ever assume who someone really is. The room stood again, but this time no clapping, just silence. Deep, reverent silence. After the event, Marla sat in the quiet garden courtyard behind the ballroom, away from the lights. Birds chirped, a breeze rustled the ivy walls. And from the corner of her eye, she noticed a young man approaching, barely 19, in a waiter's apron, shy and unsure. Ma'am, he said quietly. Can I ask you something? She smiled. Of course. My sister's in law school, he said. She's applying for your fellowship. She's scared. Said she's not polished enough. Marla leaned forward. Tell her the only thing that ever needed polishing was the silverware, not her. The boy laughed, blinking fast, to hide his emotion. He nodded and walked off, shoulders straighter than when he arrived. Marla sat back, watching the leaves fall. She had fought the good fight, and won, not with war, but with worth. Later that year, a book was published, The Maid Who Made a Movement. It became an international bestseller. In the opening dedication, Marla had written, To everyone who was ever told they were too small to matter, you were always the giants. The world just didn't know where to look.